Good evening. My name is John Davenport. I'm the Congregational Care Minister here at New Hope United Methodist Church in Gainesville, Georgia. The video you are about to watch is a grief explainer. We are talking about grief and loss. We are talking about it in a way to give concepts about grief, understanding of grief, and types of grief. And so that we can help have a basic understanding, and we're going to be having a group. But also, if you have any questions or needs, this video is great for learning a little bit, and please follow up with us afterwards. I would love to hear your questions or comments. Thank you. So, okay, thank you all for coming here tonight. Thank you all so much for being online with us. I understand that grief and loss is a complicated topic, and it's not something everybody feels comfortable with because you can get kind of sad and angry, and we'll talk about that. Good news, though, is Reverend Andrew Covington is working the comments and the streams. So if you have questions, put them to him. If you're here in the room and you feel comfortable, raise your hand. I'm going to have some space for questions later. And there's a couple church members who did me a huge blessing giving me questions that I could offer here in the room that are really vulnerable questions that'll help. But if you have questions, if y'all do, don't hesitate to stop me. This is going to be a little more on the lecture side of things, and that was my intention. Just so I make sure I introduce, my name is John Davenport. I'm the Congregational Care Minister here at New Hope United Methodist Church in Gainesville. Now, I don't mean to surprise anybody, but there's been a lot going on in the pandemic the last 3 years. And a lot of death, and a lot of loss. And so I wanted to do this because I wanted us to have a basic vocabulary to talk about grief and loss, because there's just a lot of it going on whether we like it or not. And especially here at New Hope, I know we have a lot of people who've lost spouses, who've lost family members. Like, this is the first step for more, for having a grief group, for having an open space, because sometimes life just is not fun. Sometimes it's not good at all. So, we're going to start with the question of what is grief? And we're also going to use this to test our comment section, because there's a couple spaces here and I can write up anything we say. So for the moment, if I could get any volunteers from the room, just what do you think grief is? And then Andrew can mention anything that you're typing in comments online.
Loss.
Loss?
And loneliness.
Definitely loneliness.
Yeah, I guess.
So what?
Loneliness.
Loneliness. Okay.
Sadness.
Jesse. Sadness.
I'm going to throw in readjustment.
Ooh, that's a good word.
Absolutely.
Readjustment is a good word.
Stress.
Stress.
Yeah.
Do we got any comments just yet?
Not yet.
People online, if you want to throw one in.
No, sorry.
No, you're just in time. We're just getting started. That's my jacket. Feel free to sit there.
Joy, fear.
Fear.
Fear. We're asking what is grief?
What is grief?
And I'm trying to get comments, and I want to make sure the online is working.
Stress.
Yes.
Sadness, loss, readjustment, fear.
Okay. That's a good place to start. If we have more, we'll add them up. Yes. Grief is all of these things. But the metaphor I want to start us with tonight, and the one I want to focus on, is grief is a wound. And I want to talk about that because if you're going to the hospital because you have a big hole in your arm, you can see it, you poke the hole, and then it hurts, so you stop poking it. And you go to them and you say, here, I have a hole in my arm. Grief is no less a hurt, no less a wound than a big hole in your arm. But the problem is, it's inside. Grief is when the mind and the spirit tries to accept, tries to fight moving on. Grief is when the mind and the body, which we'll talk about as well, says, no, I don't like it, it's too much. And it's not because we're stubborn, but because we just love someone or something so much that to imagine a life without it hurts. It can bleed. Grief can go out and spread out over parts of your life until you realize it's been bleeding. It can get swollen. It can start to be so big that it takes up all of your life until it feels like that's all there is. And it can get infected. Sometimes we have something we call complicated grief. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but that's something we're also going to talk about going forward. When you lose a beloved pet, it hurts. Depending on if you're a child and it's your first pet, it hurts more. If you lose a pet you've loved, it can hurt more. Over time, you can get over it. But sometimes, if grief gets infected, what that looks like is your life starts to revolve around that loss. It's all you can think about. It never leaves your mind. It occupies every second. And I wanted to mention these because it is not a sign of weakness to have grief that profound. Especially if you talk about losing a spouse, a child. It happens. Just like infections happen when we have a giant hole in our arm. Because grief can feel like it's a piece of us, a whole piece of us that's missing. And that's why I wanted to give one last definition tonight. Grief is a byproduct of love. I'm going to argue that you cannot grieve if you do not love. And the more you love, the more you have something, someone that's a part of yourself, the more you will grieve. For instance, this is a bit fresh, but I want to talk about it. It's also a bit silly. I was born in Plano, Texas. Plano, Texas is a northern suburb of Dallas, Texas. Anybody who was watching the game last night knows that I have a very familiar grief of watching the Cowboys almost make it and then not. But I love the Cowboys. So it hurts because they're my team, but it might be very different to somebody who's a 49ers fan and feels no grief and in fact was fist pumping and dancing, because the amount of love we have for that game makes it different. Yes, the Cowboys lost last night. They lost
My
that.
condolences.
So, we've talked about what grief is. Let's talk about the parts of grief. Now, these might be familiar to anybody who's heard about grief before. I want to note that I am saying parts of grief. This originally came from Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She looked at grief patterns in people who were dying. And she said, as a person is dying, how does their mind accept their own mortality? And she came up with the stages of grief, which is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I'm not saying stages because that gives a really bad idea that, like, okay, I've done the denial, so now I'm on to anger, and everything is anger. Well, okay, now I'm done with anger. And I want to make sure I'm saying no to that, because people will give themselves grief and stress and guilt if they are suddenly in denial again. They'll say, wait, I already did this. Why do I have to do this? But grief isn't a straight line. Grief kind of goes like this. And I can tell you that at that point, right there is anger. But that doesn't help you very much, because pinpointing it just gives a fact. I want to talk about what it feels like when you're dealing with each type of grief. So the first part, I gotta do. The first part I'm talking about is denial. The feeling is, this isn't happening. And the bigger the grief, the bigger the wound, the more probable denial is what you're going to face first. Because we don't like change. We like things to stay the way we like them. And one of the things we as Americans reject first and foremost is that things have to change. But they do. Because life is about growth and change and death. So denial is often one of the strongest and easiest places. Also, just a disclaimer, if you notice somebody is in denial, please don't ever tell them that they're in denial. Because the conversation, you're in denial, no I'm not, yes you are, it doesn't go anywhere. And it doesn't help, despite wanting to help them with it. The next part is anger. And I've said that the feeling is more, I'm not going to listen to you. Not even angry with someone. It's not like you said you'd mow my lawn, I paid you to mow my lawn, and you didn't do it. Not that kind of anger. Like, have you ever had somebody just ask you, how are you doing? And you weren't doing good, and you didn't want to tell them you weren't doing good, and so suddenly you're angry at them? It's that kind of anger. Because even when a person asks that, I mean, realistically, how many people actually mean it when they ask you how you're doing? How many people actually want to hear, oh, I just got out of the hospital 2 days ago, and that was really horrible. And so that's an easy place for anger to be. And anger, especially during grief, is irrational anger. That's also hard because you can feel a lot of guilt about it. You're angry at somebody, and then you don't know how to apologize because you're like, I wasn't actually angry at you. I'm angry because I lost this thing. The third part, bargaining. The feeling is, I can stop this. I can do something. I'm in control. That is one of the hardest parts of grief, is giving up control. That's why bargaining is so strong, because our mind has to say, I have the ability, the strength, I'm powerful, I can do anything. And again, as Americans, we're told that by everything. Like that's actually Reverend Andrew, being an Army Reserve or National Guard? Reserve. Being a Reserve chaplain, he's going to have men who are like, I can do everything, and their bodies are going to say no. And he has to help with that process. Because sometimes our bodies, the world, says no, and we can keep going for a while. But when we're doing that, that's a bargaining. Fourth is depression. What is the point? Life is only about loss. That's also normal. I want to say again, all of these are the normal ways in which most human beings process through their grief. These are normal parts of grief. So if you are hearing or seeing yourself in one of these, stronger than the others, that's also normal. Depression is I don't need to get out of bed. I don't need to do anything. That world is cold and unfeeling and angry people. Why do I want to be a part of that? That is also normal, because it's when the grief really starts to settle in, when the loss really starts to be powerful. Now the final part of grief, and we're going to talk about this a little more in a second, is acceptance. Listen to this feeling. I can live my life because of the love that has built me up, even with loss. Now this is a part of grief, but acceptance is also the goal of grief. Skip ahead for a second. Acceptance is what we are working toward when we talk about grief and loss. And I won't do the full quote, but I am a fan of Ted Lasso. And the therapist in there says, the truth will set you free, but first, it's going to make you really angry. That's not a direct quote. I have to sanitize it a little bit because we're in church. But sitting around like this, talking about our feelings, talking about how things hurt, it isn't fun. In fact, our minds and our bodies will literally try to get us to run away from it. That's why I appreciate y'all so much coming and listening to this, because this is not easy. Most people go through their entire lives never wanting to think about death, let alone their own, certainly not of any of their loved ones. But the reason we're talking about it is because if you wait until it happens, if you wait until you are in the middle of a giant grief wound, it can feel even more isolating and alone. We're going to come back to that, like I said, but I want to point out one thing that is going to be important. Life is only about loss is not a false statement. Life is about losing, gaining, losing again. It's a process. And that's why these parts of grief are so well known. Because our bodies and our minds 24/7 are doing this. Even if it's something as simple as we had our carolers weren't able to go out Christmas caroling last month because it was raining. And that was even a little loss because they wanted to do it. There might be some of y'all here or some of y'all watching. You wanted to do it. You wanted to go out there and spread some joy at Christmas time, and you just couldn't the way you wanted. That's why I said all of this is normal. And I want to get into what kinds of grief there are. We can get rid of that piece of paper. Andrew had the bright idea to do these as separate sheets that we can keep around instead of just a whiteboard. So we'll also have them probably hanging up when we do a grief group in the future. Because it's a lot easier when we understand and can remember these things than having to go over it all again and again and again. Okay, so when we think of grief and loss, the usual thing we think of is death. The death of a person, the death of a loved one, a pet. I want to open up our understanding about what loss is. See, a relationship loss is just that. Loss of a person, loss of a connection. Some losses can be more than one of these, but for instance, a relationship loss can also mean a divorce or a separation because it's a different relationship. Or even you and a friend saying, I don't know if I can be your friend the same way I've been in the past. That's a relationship loss as well. Material loss is a little easier because it's just a thing. Something you've lost. Now remember I was saying earlier that love plays a huge part? There is a difference between losing the napkin in your car that you really wanted to blow your nose with and losing the locket that your grandmother brought over from another country. Those two items have different amounts of value and different amounts of love attached to them. Because remember, the connection is a byproduct of love. As we're talking about each type of grief, think about how love factors in. This one's a little harder to explain, but go with me here. Intrapsychic loss is I know it's a big word, it's an internal loss of a future. What I was describing a minute ago, the carolers not being able to go house to house, there is an intrapsychic loss there, because we had a plan, and the plan was to do a thing, and we can't. That can also be when a senior in high school gets a college rejection letter. That's an intrapsychic loss. When you're going for a job and you don't get it. There's all the job pieces, but also in your head, wait, I knew what I wanted. So that one, like I said, it's harder to explain, but I really want to make sure that I help y'all understand it. Again, please, online, here in the room, ask questions if any of this isn't making sense. Because especially intrapsychic loss is one of the ones that can hurt the most because it's least understood.
Would an example of that be like your spouse that you had these plans to do and all of a sudden you've got a new future you've got to work out?
Those
Because you don't have that spouse?
losing those plans you had together can be an intrapsychic loss. Your spouse still living, but like having a terminal cancer to where you can't go traveling like you thought you would in retirement is an intrapsychic loss. Yeah. It's that kind of thing to where you had a plan and it can't be anymore.
Gotcha.
Role loss is a little more simple, getting fired. A weird way to think about it is Andrew is our senior pastor here at New Hope, and he will be a pastor in 5-10 years, but we don't know if he'll be here. It'll be the same pastor role, new place. And so that involves the loss of a place, but it keeps moving. That's a weird thing that the United Methodist pastors have to contend with, is when you show up, you have to know, I am here for a time. And that's one of the harder things for us all to do, because we think, it's harder now, but we used to think, you get a job, stay in the job 30 years, you retire. A lot of millennials and Generation Z people, when they take a job thinking, will I be here in 5 years? Will it be worth it in 10? Will it be worth it in 2? Functional loss is especially something I wanted to talk with us about, because this can range the gambit from my kid just took my keys away and I can't drive anymore, to I fell and my leg is broken. Like my wife broke her ankle Memorial Day 2020, and about 6 months it took her to be able to walk again. So for a time, she had to live with a functional loss. It's harder when it doesn't come back. Like this is hardest, ironically, on people and on family members with degenerative diseases like MS, like Alzheimer's, dementia, because you want to hold on to the person that you have for so hard. And that's where a lot of bargaining comes in too. Because I work as a hospital chaplain as well, and I've had so many people come to me and say, they've been just fine at home. Nothing's been different. And then one person will say, well, didn't they stop remembering where to drive a month or 2 ago? Well, yeah, but they were still remember. And then last week, didn't they forget our names? And that's a really hard loss sometimes, even on a family member. Now, this one, I just want to make sure we get a systemic loss is something like was described earlier. Losing a spouse or losing a child, in my experience, is the biggest loss you can face. Because it hits everything. Also losing a parent. Because a lot of us still think of ourselves as someone's child. But a tough question is, am I still a child if my parents are no longer here? Am I still a parent if I've lost my child? In our culture and in the Bible, when you lose a husband, we have a word to describe that loss. You're no longer a wife, you're a widow. And even in the early Christian era, they did a lot to try to help and support widows because they knew that that loss hit extra hard. So that's what I mean by a systemic loss. It's something that hits every part of us. And those are not only the hardest, but they're the ones that we want to make sure we're asking for help on. Because I have said a couple times, all of this is normal. The parts of grief are normal, the types of grief are normal. But remember, grief is a wound. And it's harder to keep track of because it's internal. You can't look at it, you can't see the pus of grief the way you could in a cut or in a big wound. So one of the reasons we're talking about this is because I know that we have a lot of people who have lost spouses, lost children in this church, and it is incredibly lonely. Speaking of systemic loss, I've only mentioned it once so far, but the pandemic, COVID-19, has been a systemic loss. Because all we've experienced for 3 years is change. Like I said, as a hospital chaplain, I can remember a time when people couldn't come into the hospital. I can remember a time when we ran out of almost everything. I can remember a time when people could not process the trauma of the pandemic and had to leave. In fact, this might surprise y'all, but most of my life I have hated masks with an utter fiery burning passion. In fact, when I did my training at the VA, I threw them away the moment that I could get rid of them. And then I started going into COVID patients' rooms in February of 2020. And I saw the damage, and I saw the hurt, and I worried about possibly it hurting my own wife. Because my wife, as I've told some of y'all, but I want to make sure I'm sharing, she has a condition called gastroparesis. Gastroparesis. It means the nerve in her stomach doesn't work, and her stomach doesn't churn. Unless new research, unless new medical science finds a way, my wife will not, for the rest of her life, have a normal stomach. So she has pregnancy-level nausea 24/7.
Oh, no.
She has chronic pain. She has to think about what she can and can't do. In fact, a year ago, I guess it's a year and a half ago, we went on a second honeymoon in November of 2021 because part of her condition is that she is anemic and loses iron in her blood. And she had lost so much iron at the time of our wedding that she loses some short-term memories. And I had to push her at Disney World around in a wheelchair because with her broken ankle and her gastroparesis, I did 37,000 steps that day. She did 12,000 and it still hurt her. She could not do as many steps or move as fast as I could. So I want y'all to think, in what I'm sharing, how many of these she's having to realize. And she's not alone. Like, part of the reason I wear a mask, the biggest reason, is because if I were to get COVID in a patient's room, take it home to my wife, and give her even more medical conditions, I could never forgive myself. And also, when I've been meeting in homes with y'all, you have always seen me in a mask. Like I said, I'm not a fan, but if I ever gave y'all anything I got at the hospital, it's not like I meant to. It's not like I was doing things that I wasn't supposed to do, but that's the nature that I've had to grieve and accept. And that's what this looks like. That's what grief looks like, is we're talking about learning how to live life, recognizing that change is going to be a thing. Now remember, we called that change acceptance. Just to check, Andrew, since I've been going for a little bit, have we had any comments, questions, anything show up online?
Nothing yet.
Okay. Any comments or questions in the room? Anything that's not making sense? Anything I'm going too fast on?
No, I think you're hitting it on the head.
Okay. So this is where I really want y'all to listen. Everything I've described, and please go back and watch this video, even y'all who are here. This is a lot of detail. This is two books that I can recommend that I read. Is one, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, by Megan Devine. And then this one, it's a little crunchier, but it's When Grief is Complicated, by Dr. Alan D. Wolfelt. This is actually for psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, about trying to help people with grief. But both of these have helped, and I'm going to find us some books that we can talk through in our grief group. But when we are going to meet, hopefully sometime in February, Andrew and I need to get it figured out, the first thing we're going to do on the first day is nothing. The first thing we're going to do on the first day is sit still and listen. Listen to each other, listen to ourselves. I know that is a scary thing to say. But the reason I need to say it is because grief, every part of it, involves doing something. Moving, trying. And the power of acceptance, the goal of acceptance, involves hearing and thinking about difficult and sad things. The truth can set you free, but first it's going to anger you. Acceptance is the end of the beginning. Because remember, anybody can say, I got it, I'm good, everything's great, I can accept my grief. It's not that kind of acceptance. It's the kind of being able to sit in a quiet room, and if you cry, you cry, and if you hurt, you hurt. It's also being able to sit in a quiet room and hurting and realizing, I think I'm hurting too much, and I think I need help. One strategy I want to give y'all as we work toward acceptance, because we all do it every day, lean into love. It is really easy, and I'm talking from experience, to let life embitter you.
Say again?
It is easy to let life make you bitter. It is easy to say, screw it all, I don't want any of it, it isn't worth it. And when I say I speak from experience, I have had more than a few moments where I don't think anybody would have faulted me for walking away or saying it's not worth it. But I am here as your congregational care minister, as a person who encourages hope, as a chaplain, as a believer in the truth and life of Jesus Christ. I am here to tell you there is resurrection. There is life after death, even if it means the death of the person you love the most, the death of the dream that you thought would carry you forward into eternity. There is life and life abundant available if you will take the time to hurt and grieve. That's something that I need to say over and over again, because I know there's a lot of people who go, just talk about that sad stuff. John's just always about sad. No, this is an act of hope. I know it's going to sound weird. Going to the dentist is an act of hope. I'm getting some looks in the room, and Going to the dentist means that you believe there is a future in which you will need your teeth to function.
Good point.
Getting a physical is an act of hope, because it means
I'm finished.
because it means that you can see a future in which your health is something you have control over. Taking care of your mental health, seeing a therapist, seeing a grief coach, seeing a counselor, talking to your pastors about the things that hurt you are acts of hope. because it means you can envision a world in which processing and dealing with the things that hurt you is possible. And that's what I'm here to really say today, is that it is possible to process grief. It is possible to accept a world that is a bit more chaotic than we want, and that means we will sometimes lose things and lose people. I would not be your pastor if I did not believe that that world is worth hoping and fighting for. That does not mean that I have all the answers. That does not mean I know what to do. What it means is that I have hope. And I hope that you will too. Now, we have, thanks be to God, gotten some really vulnerable questions from our church members. And I want to ask those one by one, and I'm not saying I have answers, but talk you through them at first. But I wanted to ask before I do, given everything we've talked about, what questions do you have about grief here in the room? What questions do you have online? What doesn't make sense? What pisses you off about what I've said?
I'm wondering how much damage you could do to yourself. I'm wondering how much damage could occur to you if you did not go through the steps.
Can I go back to your original framing? You can do a lot of damage to yourself. the anger of grief, among other things, gets directed inward. Because you can't take a punch at every person you see. They're going to put you in jail. But you can beat yourself up. You can tell yourself you're doing wrong. You can tell yourself that you're not worthy. You can tell yourself that they didn't like you in the first place. You can do a lot of damage with grief. Anything online?
Not yet. I'm
Okay.
asking, but we are online's about a minute and a half behind.
Oh, damn.
So they're
That'll
just
do it.
getting.
Well, thank you for that. Any others?
Can you transfer your grief to something that's not healthy? I don't mean like alcohol or anything, but like somebody or, you know.
Absolutely. You can use alcohol.
Well, I'm not talking about alcohol.
No.
But I'm just, yeah. Well, just being truthful here, I gave up drinking when my husband passed because I found I was dwelling in it. You know, it was just like, well, I'm here by myself, I'm so lonely, let's just drink this bottle of wine, make, you know, what do you call that, self-medicating.
Self-medicating.
And so I just thought, you know, I'm just giving it up 100%. It's been a year.
Well,
I don't miss it, but I just found it was like not good. Because
Right.
then I was so upset. But I feel like I'm like turning my grief into latching on to other people.
that's a great question. Thank you. And for the record, I did 2 years as a chaplain resident at the VA. I did 2 years of chaplain training at the VA. The second year was in substance use and homelessness. And I'm here to tell you that a lot of our veterans, part of why I support them so much, and Andrew wants to support active duty members, self-medicate. That is a normal thing, especially I did a grief group it was the domiciliary at Fort McPherson. It was a 6-week inpatient program, and I did a weekly grief group. And more often than not, it was, I lost my son, and the drinking started again. Or I lost this and it started. But let me give you a really small way that is really interesting. When I said earlier that somebody asks you, how are you doing? And you said sometimes you get angry at them for doing it. Sometimes the reason you're angry is legitimate, because people will take their own grief out on you. A good way to try to do that is somebody says, you're fine, everything's fine, you're fine. You notice the hands are coming toward. That is taking out your grief on someone. And everybody does it. Like, that's not even like they have big grief, but just it's preemptive. Like, I don't want to hear about what's happening to you, so they'll literally push you away. Or you'll say, I need my friend to be around. If my friend is around, I'll be fine. And that's another way you can do that. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Another word you're going to hear me say an awful lot is boundaries. It's kind of in fashion, but boundaries are good. And it's scary for all the grief reasons, but it's also always good to ask somebody, like, it's going to be weird. It's like, hey, am I putting too much on you? I feel like I am. And it's a scary question, but it sets a good boundary because it gives them the chance to say yes or no. And if they say yes or no, you can say, can I do anything about that? Do you need anything from me? Like, it's a way to build a relationship is to check in occasionally. Because it's a lot easier with a person than a bottle, because the bottle you just open. But.
And I found with my grief that with my children and my grandchildren and my friends, it's like I haven't been able to grieve all the time because I'm having to calm them down and be their support and listen to them, and I'm like, be the strong one. So it's grief is not fun.
It is not fun.
No.
Acceptance isn't fun because and this is something I tell folks all the time in the hospital, if you find you're the strong one, you need to find somebody you can be weak around. Now thankfully y'all have two people right here who would love to let you be weak around them and listen, but it's hard. It's hard to trust that. But yeah, no, keep track of because remember I said some people push away the grief, push away the people? If you find someone who is grieving and willing to grieve alongside you, that's the best kind of support and relationship, because that person and you can talk openly about things that might scare other people. Not because they're big and scary, but because they don't want to hear about it. Remember we were talking earlier about denial, about bargaining? When you start talking about your grief and somebody says, whoa, I don't need to hear about that, I'm doing fine, that's denial. That's bargaining. I'm strong enough, you might have a problem, but I've got everything under control. And as fun as it sounds, y'all, none of us really do. We're all doing our best.
That's right.
And we all need help.
That's life. Even without the grief, it's life. We're all trying our best.
Well, let me read y'all something a little bit. I'm hoping we'll get a couple, if they're a minute and a half behind, I'm hoping we'll get some comments. But like I said, this is from It's Okay to Not Be Okay by Megan Devine. Look, here's the deal. I never wanted to be a grief therapist. If my husband hadn't died, I would have likely left the therapy field altogether. In the days before he died, I told him I was tired of being in the pain business. After he died, I closed my practice. I never saw clients again. But grief made me lonely in ways I had never known, and I had known lonely. That loneliness drew me to search for those people who would become my tribe. That needle in an invisible haystack search, with all its dead ends and wrong turns and disappointments, is why I do the work I do now. I couldn't stand the thought of new people being thrown into the world of grief and finding nothing, hearing nothing that sounded like them. That's why we're here tonight, y'all. That's why I'm talking about this. I'm breaking the taboo of you're not supposed to talk about it. Because if we don't, people will hurt themselves. If we don't, people will suffer alone, and I cannot abide that. We got any comments or questions still?
Not yet.
We're still online though, right?
We are.
Okay.
We got viewers they're just viewing.
Okay. If viewers can view.
I in my situation, I went through with my mom a couple of years of caretaking, And my sole, fortunately I was retired, and my sole purpose was taking care of her. And then she passed. And Jim and I had like a year of doing some things that we had planned on doing. And then he got to the point where he had back issues and he couldn't do things. And then, of course, he had a stroke when I was out in Montana visiting my daughter. And it's like, it's like I was saying a while ago, your whole future is and your partner is not there, and it's like, what do I do? How do I handle all this by myself? It's like, you're just kind of thrown into this world that you're not used to, that you're not expecting. It's like I'm getting over my mom, and now all of a sudden I've lost my husband. Yeah.
Double whammy.
Well, and that's a really good question, since we're talking about questions, is how can I do all of this by myself? My honest answer is you don't. But there is some grief in building up new patterns to get through life. Because the new things you have to do to keep living will no longer involve the person who used to be part of the old ways. That's part of the hurt of acceptance, is, everybody's like, oh, you're doing so great, and you're moving forward, and then all of this time inside you're hurting and dying and saying like, but he should be here. She should be doing this with me. And that's completely normal. Completely understandable. That's the sneaky kind of grief. Let me do some of the questions and we can kind of go along the way we're doing. A question I got is, what's my life going to be like now that I'm alone? And I wanted to mention that one because it's scary. And it gets scarier when the answer is, it could be anything you want. The scariest thing about living into a new life is the ability to create again. Because you say, what's the point? Life is only about loss. Why should I create another set of things if I'm just going to lose them again? And that's where the grief work really helps. That's where knowing this stuff can really come into play. Because if I have built the perfect life and now it's gone, so I have to build the perfect life again, you have two huge insurmountable tasks. Like, I already did it, why do I have to do it again? But it's not, life isn't an if-then, it's an if-and. If you go from, I did this and it was perfect and it's gone, now I have to do it again, to, what is my life going forward, what am I creating? It's that gentle reframing of, whatever I build doesn't have to be perfect. But it can be something that gives me hope and strength and help. It's little things like that which can make life livable. And that goes along with another question I got, is how do I handle the quietness? The quietness of grief and loss, the quietness of an empty house. My only answer is to choose things to fill it with. And to sit in the quiet. To sit in the hurt occasionally. Not forever, not to where you get stuck. But I think we're afraid of the quiet in this country. I think we're afraid of silence. I have studied, as part of my bachelor's degree is in psychology, and I studied a lot of different meditative practices. I've done even more of that in my chaplain training in seminary. And it's never fun to just sit there, especially for me. But there is a beauty in silence. And there is a time for loud noises. Both can be true. The next question I got is, why do I just want to hibernate? I'm curious, given everything we've talked about, if any of y'all might know an answer to that question. Why do I always just want to hibernate?
To hibernate,
Yeah,
probably to protect yourself from more pain.
that's a great answer. Thank you. Why else, y'all? Why would you want to just hibernate at home?
To not have to deal with it, with the questions with people and explanations and lying and saying I'm good when I'm not.
If you're at
Putting
home,
up a front.
if you're at home, you don't have to have that front up.
Yeah.
You don't have to tell anybody you're doing good. You don't have to answer question after question. And this is where I also encourage y'all, find people, make a pack. Find people who know what it is to feel the way you feel. That's, even like I said, when I was at the VA, I helped with a Vietnam Veteran Support Group for Vietnam veterans with PTSD. Because they were going through and had gone through a serious thing that they could never forget. And so my job was to help them listen to themselves and each other. Never underestimate the value of knowing that you're not alone, y'all. Even knowing one other person knows what you do is important. We had a question, is it normal to have physical symptoms of grief? We kind of talked about that already, about beating yourself up, anger turned inward. None of this just stays in your head. I just want to hit that back one more time. As we're talking about all this, like the easiest way to explain what does it look like when you're angry, you punch somebody in the face. There are a lot of little ways. You'll see people like hunched over in depression. You'll see people like literally push people away when they're trying to be in denial. Like it seems obvious, but like people will literally like show you how they're feeling. And a big thing I want to encourage y'all is to, as you're doing that, as you see how people are, let them know you see them. Let them know you hear them. Because them knowing that they're not alone can help a lot. Just to check, since y'all with the time delay and everything are a little chattier, have I said the words grief is normal enough times tonight? Should I say it one more time just to be safe?
Sure.
Okay. All of this is normal. The question I got is all of this normal? It is. All of this is normal and regular, and going through the process, it takes time. Like, I'm giving y'all a lot of information, but it takes a while to realize maybe I'm doing this too much, or maybe I'm staying home too much. And it takes a little while longer to go, do I have the strength to stop doing that? It takes time.
I will say one thing. I can't imagine going through loss without knowing that you've got God there with you.
Oh, yes.
I
couldn't
can't imagine somebody that doesn't believe in God, that doesn't have God there with me to help me through this struggle.
Amen.
And friends, and friends and family that are helping.
If I can also say, be careful about that.
About what?
About saying, I have God here with me. because people will sometimes say, but I have God with me, why is this still hurting?
Well, that's
Why aren't
true.
why aren't I getting through it? God, or, you know, people might say, oh, you just need more God.
That's true.
And I just find myself like, I mean, I'm still pretty overwhelmed that it's been 2 years, but I'll say, help me, God, help me, help me. And I'm like, you know, I stay so tense. I don't like it. I feel like I've been plugged into an electric socket most of the time. Like, what does that mean?
In what way?
I mean, is that normal? Have you heard somebody say that? I'm like,
So
what's wrong with
I
me?
was just talking about the physical manifestations.
Yes.
Tensing up.
Yes.
That is an easy way to feel everything. Tensing up is an easy way to have your whole body, because you've got all this energy, and it can't go out, and you keep trying to hold it in. It is, you're not wrong in the metaphor, it is kind of like holding a socket. Eventually, like, you gotta, you know, it's hard to let go of that open socket, right? But otherwise, it's gonna keep shocking you. That's one thing I always tell people, especially when I'm teaching martial arts, is if you do this, go with me, I'll do this. Do your fists as tight as you can. As tight as you can, and like, go. Same thing, tight, and go. Even that little motion can actually help you.
It did. So just sitting here though, this whole, you know, since we've been going, I feel it coming more and more and more because it's like I'm holding back. I mean, I would love to just have a boo-hoo right there. But that's my life now.
And that is completely normal and completely understandable. Little physical things can help with those moments. Have y'all ever heard the saying, one day at a time? Sometimes it's 1 minute at a time.
I didn't mean to do that.
Exactly.
No, but literally, y'all, breathe. When you're feeling like that, like, I know it seems silly, you know, you're like, but sincerely, like, take it from somebody who's taught martial arts for 8 of the last 12 years he did it. Little physical things can get out the energy. Like, I've been talking about quiet, I've been talking about sitting still. Y'all, sometimes there is no good reason to sit still, and you need to get up and dance. Or you need to get up and move, because otherwise, it feels like getting stuck on a socket. And yes, that kind of physical manifestation of grief is completely normal. If it happens like every day, for hours a day, that is not normal, get some help with it. If it's something that you have some kind of control over, even doing something, but it's the same thing, like if your leg just keeps throbbing for 2 or 3 weeks, don't wait 2 or 3 weeks for your leg to be throbbing to go to the doctor or the hospital. Like, when you're hurting, ask for help. Now, I have talked about a lot. Did we ever get any comments? Did they ever catch up?
They're watching, they didn't put anything in the chat.
Okay. I don't want to leave anybody out. And I especially want to thank everyone who has come here in person and all of y'all who are watching online. Y'all, when we have our grief group, when we do it, I'm going to invite people to come. I am not going to stipulate that you have to talk. You can be silent at a grief group. Sometimes they do those round robins where everybody has to say something. I'm not going to do that to anybody because grief and sharing of grief takes time, takes trust, takes vulnerability. And the biggest thing I want to say is thank you, all of you, for taking the time to be vulnerable here tonight.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This is, now, I want to leave us with this. It's the 11 tenets of companioning mourners. Again, this book has lots of good things. I want to share this because there are good ways and not so good ways to help people as they're grieving. But before I share this and before we close out, does anybody have any more comments? Anything that I've missed? Okay. Now, and this is also, Reverend Andrew has been very helpful in doing the streaming and in doing the recording. The reason we're doing this as a recording is because I want people to be able to go back and watch and then come talk to me. Come talk to Reverend Andrew. This is the beginning of a conversation, the beginning of us trying to do better about caring for everybody's grief. This is not the end, okay? So after today, you know how to get in touch with me. My information will be with this video. Call, email, let me know how to support you. Because I appreciate y'all here in the room asking questions, the church members who gave me these wonderful questions. I do not have all the answers. And my answer may occasionally be, that sounds like something you should see a therapist about. Or, I know this great grief coach. Let's call them. But I'm going to do everything I can, and Andrew's going to do everything he can to support y'all, to talk about this, and to make a space where we can feel these things. Because y'all, I'm not kidding when I say that we are in a national mental health crisis, and that a lot of people are bargaining for a normal that no longer exists in a world that they want to be post-COVID. We have a surge in the hospitals in Georgia right now. They're pretty full of COVID and they're getting a little more full. There's a lot out there. Please be safe. There's a lot of COVID out there because people have been told by people in leadership that it's 2019 out there, everything's great, everything's gone, and you can just go about your life. I am here to tell you that is denial and bargaining. And as long as there's COVID and the flu and RSV this winter, please stay safe. Because viruses can and will hurt you. And I think if we're faithful, if we're talking about grief, we'll be better off than a lot of people. And I think people will want to come and talk to you because I guarantee you, if you are processing your grief, it is the same as if you are a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. Someone will come up to you and say, you look like you hurt the way I hurt. Or I heard you lost your spouse. Or I heard you lost your child. What's different about you? And I want to make sure that we have the tools to help them. So, I want to finish today with 11 basic principles of companioning or caring for people who are grieving. This helps whether you are doing it just in a one-on-one, whether it's somebody you love. These are good tips to be helpful and healing with grief. Tenet 1. Companioning is about being present to another person's pain. It is not about taking away the pain. I hope y'all hear in everything I have said tonight, I am not telling you not to feel pain or that I'm going to take away pain, but that I'm going to sit with it. Tenet 2. Companioning is about going into the wilderness of the soul and with another human being. It is not about thinking you are responsible for finding the way out. Tenet 3. Companioning is about honoring the Spirit. It is not about focusing on the intellect. Tenet 4. Companioning is about listening with the heart, not analyzing with the head. Tenet 5. Companioning is about bearing witness to the struggles of others. It is not about judging or directing their struggles. Tenet 6. Companioning is about walking alongside It is not about leading. Tenet 7. Companioning is about discovering the gifts of sacred silence. It is not about filling up every moment with words. Tenet 8. Companioning is about being still. It is not about frantic movement forward. Tenet 9. Companioning is about respecting disorder and confusion. It is not about imposing order and logic. Tenet 10. Companioning is about learning from others. It is not about teaching them. Tenet 11. Companioning is about compassionate curiosity. It is not about expertise. Everything I have shared with you tonight is things that I have been grateful enough to learn from others. The things that I am sharing with you are from my own grief process that I have learned. Myself and Andrew are only here because we are in and doing this work. We are not perfect. We don't know everything. But we are going to be with you in grief and loss because that is what we do. And I am so thankful for all of you for coming out and being here tonight for this. Let's end with a prayer. Father of mercy, Father of love, Father of grief, be with our hearts this night. Help us to know that you are here in the silence, that you are with us with your love, and that you will go nowhere, but stay ever close by our sides. Thank you for the gift of your Son Jesus, for the hope of resurrection, and for the peace that passes all understanding. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen.